Hi everyone. I want to provide a additional video about communicative language teaching to hopefully clarify some questions and give you a little bit more information about how to incorporate CLT into your own teaching. So just to start, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Is this a communicative language teaching task? Interview your partner and find out what he or she did last night. Is this a communicative language teaching task? Restate the question using inversion. And we have the French, est-ce que vous parlez espagnol? And the answer would be, parlez-vous espagnol? And you can see the continuation of that exercise. So are either of these communicative language teaching tasks, or are they both communicative language teaching tasks? Interview your partner, find out what he or she did last night, restate the question using inversion. So what do you think? So we'll answer this in a moment. But first, let's take a step backwards and talk about communication. Communication, as defined in the sense of language teaching and language acquisition, is the expression, interpretation, and sometimes negotiation of meaning in a given context. Communication also must have a purpose. So, if teachers and students are not engaged in the expression and interpretation of meaning, they are not engaged in communication. If there isn't a communicative purpose to what they're doing, meaning that their activity or their assignment is for language practice only, then the teachers and the students may not actually be engaged in a communicative event. So just because people are talking in your classroom does not necessarily mean that you have communicative language teaching tasks in your classroom or that students are actually communicating with language. Why is this so important? Well, as we have seen with second language acquisition theories earlier in our course, communication with language is what drives acquisition. So when students are receiving input, remember we talked about I+1 input from Krashen's theory about slightly extending students a little bit beyond their current level, and then asking them to use whatever internal language they have formed in their head to express things, to communicate with purpose, often meaning that they have to interpret and even negotiate meaning with other people, then they are going to, without doubt, begin to acquire more language, right? Okay, so what is the communicative purpose? So we said that communication has to be purposeful. It has to have a purpose. Well, the possible purposes that we see with language are psychosocial, cognitive, informational, and of course, we could include entertainment. For the majority of our language teaching, though, we're going to focus on psychosocial and cognitive informative. So psychosocial is like BICS, if you remember that basic intercommunication skills. It's establishing, maintaining relationships. It's asking how people are doing. It's asking how they're feeling or what kind of worries they have or what they're doing that day. It's simply to establish and maintain relationships with others. Cognitive informational is everything else that we typically use. And that's like when we're learning information about other people or maybe the world around us, or we're getting information to complete another task, right? So maybe I'm learning your phone number because I want to call you later, right, for homework help. Or maybe I'm reading a pamphlet because I'm trying to put together a dresser for my daughter. Okay, so those are the two main purposes of communicating. We also know language can be used for entertainment, like we've seen with comedy sketches, or you can think about tongue twisters or jokes or riddles, even like poetry or monologues that are meant just for entertainment purposes. Language can also be used for that. Okay, so again, we're looking in our classroom to have tasks we're using that word purposefully here, tasked to include the expression, the interpretation, negotiation of meaning with a purpose beyond just practicing the past tense or practicing new vocabulary or identifying direct objects and indirect objects, pronouns in our sentence, right? We want to have a purpose that is authentic. Is it psychosocial, making relationships? Or are we getting some information or learning something, cognitive informational? Okay, so what are communicative language tasks or CLT, right? Communicative language teaching tasks. They require expression, interpretation, and sometimes negotiation of meaning, and they have a purpose. So expression is often the like verbal output, right? But it could also be maybe pointing to a picture. Maybe it is putting a check in a checkbox, but somehow you are expressing something. Maybe it's writing on a whiteboard and holding up that word or the expression. Okay. Interpretation has to do with looking at language or hearing language and making sense of it to ourselves based upon whatever interlanguage we have formed at that point in our brains with that language. Negotiation of meaning is what happens when if you and I are talking and you say something that I don't quite understand, or maybe I don't hear it fully, and then I'll say, huh, or I'll ask for clarification or more information. And maybe then you have to go back and speak louder or reformulate or add some description to your language. And then finally, they have to have a purpose beyond quote unquote language practice, psychosocial, cognitive, informational purposes. And of course, you might also try to use entertainment, but for the majority of our time in language class, we want to focus on psychosocial and cognitive informational purposes of language tasks. So let's go back to that question that we had at the beginning of our PowerPoint. Is this a communicative language teaching task? Interview your partner and find out what he or she did last night. Is this a communicative language teaching task? Happens to come from French, but you could imagine something similar to this in an English language classroom. Restate the question using inversion. Okay, we'll come back to it. I want to give you a little bit more context. So here's another example. Interview your partner so that you can create an informational sheet for your professor about your partner. So very, very similar to that first example I gave you, interview your partner about what he or she did last night. But what's the difference? What do you notice here? Now we have a purpose. We have the purpose of getting information to create a informational sheet that your instructor or your professor is going to keep so that they have information about the class students. Also, notice that while I have this outline of information that I need to get from my partner, I'm going to have to come up with the questions. So the first one is my name is, and I would put my own name there. And then I begin to fill out the profile of my classmate. So I would have to know how to say, what is your name? So that I could enter this information. My classmate's name is, and I would fill in his or her name. Then I might have to say, where are you from? He or she is from, and maybe I add the country or the city where he or she is from. His or her major is, so I might have to ask the student, what is your major? Okay, so a lot of expression of language here. Definitely some interpretation because I'm writing down what they're saying. I have to make sense of it. And so there's also negotiation. I have to clarify and make sure that I understand the language being provided. And is there a purpose? Yes, you're creating this informational sheet that's going to serve a bigger purpose than just interview your partner, right? Practice saying hello and what is your name and where are you from. The bigger purpose here is that we're creating a resource for our professor. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So let's go back and look at the difference here. And then we'll talk about those first two examples. So there's a difference between exercises, activities, and tasks. And I know I haven't used this language previously in the course, but I thought based upon questions, we should dig into this a little bit deeper. So, exercises, activities, and tasks. If you think about this continuum from not communicative to fully communicative, that's how we're going to think about exercises, activities, and tasks. So, you can probably already imagine that the exercise on the low side, with no communicative purpose, right? No, not a communicative language teaching activity, is that there really is no intention to express or interpret meaning. The sole purpose is to practice language. So think back to that French example with write the inversions of each of these statements. How would you ask that with an inversion? That is an exercise. There's no communicative purpose. We're not building social relationships. We're not asking for information, right? So it's not cognitive informational. It's definitely not entertainment. So these activities, rather exercises, these assignments do not promote or cause acquisition of language, despite what probably many of you have experienced as a learner of another language, or maybe even as you have seen other teachers or you have yourself taught in the past. These are really a waste of time. They're taking up time, precious time in class in which we really want to focus more on tasks. Okay, so that was the first one, that very first, I guess it was the second example with the French inversions. That's an exercise. Activities are a little bit better on the continuum from non-communicative to fully communicative because activities may include expression and interpretation of meaning, but they do not have a communicative purpose. So think about that very first example. Interview your partner about what he or she did last night. Okay. Students are going to largely see that assignment as language practice. My teacher wants me to practice past tense verbs. What did you do last night? The students might even say things that they didn't really do. I will tell you, when I taught Spanish, my students would always tell me that um, que están cansados, right? They're tired all the time, y que juegan videojuegos, right? They play video games. Why? Because those were the first things that popped into their head, perhaps. And it was an easy thing that they could say quickly without really having to think, right, into their interlanguage and draw on some language. So they could be saying things that really don't express any meaning for themselves. Okay. Um, no communicative purpose because we're really not doing anything with this. It's just for language practice. Now, moving to fully communicative, we have our tasks. So they include expression, right? Interpretation of meaning, and have a communicative purpose. So think about, again, that example, interview your partner to create an informational sheet for your professor. So here, students are using language in an authentic way. That's to express information to someone else about their schedule, about their classes, about their major. So our goal and the goal of your micro teaching is to use tasks, communicative tasks, in which students are using language for expression, interpretation, perhaps negotiation, and there is a communicative purpose. So, Mythbuster. Students need to practice vocabulary and grammar as part of learning to communicate. Do you hear this from other teachers? Have you experienced this as a language learner? Teachers always say to me, oh, but I need my students to practice vocabulary before they can use it. Well, practicing vocabulary in an inauthentic, non-communicative way is not going to assist or lead to acquisition of language. So that time is really not serving your learners. So what's normally taught and practiced as grammar or vocabulary is not what students take with them. It's not what lands and gets pulled into the interlanguage that is inside learners' heads. Learners don't get a linguistic system in their heads from practice of exercises and activities. Rather, we know learners acquire language from a complex interaction between input, that I+1, good input in the classroom, and internal mechanisms inside the learner themselves. The mechanism of universal grammar and just general learning architecture that act on input, that pull it up, and they make sense of, the learners make sense of, does this seem to correspond with what's already in my interlanguage, or is this a change? And they make sense of that. Sometimes they might hold both at the same time. Sometimes they have to replace something that was previously in their interlanguage with this based upon the new information, the new learning, the new input that they got. Okay. So no, students do not need to practice vocabulary and grammar as part of learning to communicate. They need to communicate with vocabulary and utilizing grammar as part of their interlanguage to acquire language and to improve that interlanguage, because our interlanguage is somewhere again on a continuum between totally not like the real language we're trying to get, like that English, academic English that you're trying to acquire, towards becoming closer and closer to that real thing. Okay, second step. I want you to compare these two tasks. This is task A, sedentary or active. So you would give to students this list and you'd say, look over the activities, check off the ones you did yesterday. So I read, they might make a check mark. I worked at the computer, so they read the statements and they check off what they did. Next step is interview your partner, asking them if they did the activities from step 1, but notice we provide the questions. Did you read something? Did you work at your computer? Did you work out? Did you exercise? Did you ride your bike somewhere? Did you walk somewhere, etc. Right? And they would note their partner's response. Yes, no, etc. Then they have to make sense of this information. They have to have some evaluation, negotiation here, interpretation of the meaning. Rate yourself and your partner based upon the information you have obtained in step 1 and step 2. Are you very active as a person or very sedentary or somewhere in between? How would you rate yourself? How would you rate your partner on that scale? Okay, so that's one task. Now consider a very similar task, but just a slight variation. Same thing, active or sedentary, but now notice the steps are a little bit different. Step 1, list 10 activities that you did yesterday. So you might make a list. I worked out, I rode my bike, I worked on my computer, I went to class, I had dinner with my family, I watched a movie, I went to bed, right? Now, step 2, interview someone in class. Notice there's no questions. Now you have to come up with the questions yourself. So I look back at my list and I would ask my partner, did you work out? And they might say yes or no. Did you go to class? Yes or no. Okay, noting the person's response. Step 3 is the same. Rate yourself and your partner on the scale based upon what you learned. Are you very active or very sedentary? What about your partner? And then a final step, which I didn't list here, was that the teacher or instructor would discuss this as a class. They might record the ratings of each person and come up with like an average for the class. They might compare it with the instructor's activity level. Okay, so first of all, are these tasks really tasks? Are they communicative tasks? What do you think? Right? Remember our definition. Do they include expression and interpretation of meaning and have a communicative purpose? Okay, so expression of meaning is that they're indicating, right? Maybe a check mark, or in this task B, they wrote it out. Okay, so there is expression. What about interpretation of meaning? Yes, there is interpretation of meaning because on both tasks, they had to rate themselves. Are you very active or very sedentary? And then discuss that as a class. Negotiation, there's probably negotiation. You're working with a partner, you have to understand each other. You might have to ask for clarification or ask them to speak up. Okay. And is there a purpose? What's the purpose here? Is it psychosocial? I would say no. Cognitive informational? I would say yes, because you're trying to learn about each other and the world around you. How active are people? Do people tend to be active or sedentary? Are students, in your cohort, active or sedentary? Is your professor sedentary or active? You're learning information about others. Okay, so both task A and task B are both tasks. They're communicative language teaching tasks. But what's the difference between them? Because there is a difference. Notice here, we're checking off things you did, right? I think I've provided the example as well when we were talking about breakfast foods from IHOP. Which breakfast foods are your favorite? Which ones are not your favorites you don't want to order? Checking things off, okay? Whereas task B, they just had to list activities they did. Maybe they had to list menu items they would order. All right, so the difference between these two tasks are called input-oriented or output-oriented. And this is a very important distinction because oftentimes teachers will tell me, well, my students are beginners. They can barely say anything at all. How can they communicate with language? Well, that's where input-oriented tasks come in because learners do not create with language. They use the language given to them. They still express ideas, preferences, beliefs, but they don't have to actually produce like they do in an output-oriented task like we saw in task B. Learners create meaning on their own. They have to come up with their own sentences. They have to come up with their own questions to ask each other. Much more cognitively demanding. So a beginner class would likely stick with input-oriented tasks. An advanced class, advanced learners might start with an input-oriented task maybe early in the unit and then move to an output-oriented task later in that same class or later in the unit. Teachers can use both types of tasks with their learners. You don't have to just stick to one type. But you do need to be thoughtful about scaffolding students along this this level of how much they're going to have to create and produce with language, a language that's new for them. All right, so that's the difference between receptive language, listening and reading, versus expressive language, speaking and writing. That's output. So you decide what your English language learner is going to work on, and maybe you do both in the same class, or maybe you start with receptive and move to expressive. So again, input-oriented tasks allow for communication when learners have limited expressive ability with language, whereas output-oriented tasks allow for communication when learners have more expressive ability with language. And as I mentioned, teachers can use both, right? So rather than just saying, oh, my students don't know anything, how can they have these communicative language teaching tasks? Well, they can if teachers put in place input-oriented tasks that lower that cognitive demand and scaffold their ability to express, maybe with a check mark or a picture or a pointing, negotiate meaning, and still have that communicative purpose. All right, more examples of communicative language tasks that are great to do. You could have students create a pamphlet. Here's a template of a pamphlet where students would have, they would feature a place to visit. Maybe it's a place in their hometown. Maybe it's their home country. Maybe it's a place they want to visit. Okay, create a pamphlet. Or you could ask your students, create a pamphlet that would be given to a student who was new to this class next year. Or a pamphlet giving tips to international students who come to our university for the first time. Another idea is have students create a Wikipedia page. This Wikipedia page could be about a movie that they have watched. It could be about an experience that they have had. Perhaps if you take a class on an outing around your school or to the garden or even, let's say, to the art museum, they could record, what they did, what they saw, what they bought, etc., in their pamphlet. Could you have students script and film a documentary? So, with a documentary, you could ask students to interview English speakers about a topic and then produce a very short film about that topic featuring the language from that native English speaker, let's say. So, they would come up with the interview questions, they would interview a person, record it, and put it together in a documentary. You could also ask them to film a documentary about their own family, where they're presenting their family and they go home with their smartphone and they present each person, saying, "This is my daughter. Her name is, she is 7 years old. She goes to school. She likes to play soccer and basketball," right? Short documentary incorporating real things going on. It has a communicative purpose because they're sharing information with their classmates about their family. You could have students create a collage. I've done this with adult learners, and where I brought in a bunch of old magazines. I have a huge supply if you want to try this out. And I asked, in my particular case, they were working on clothing vocabulary, so they had to create a collage of clothing, and they had to look up using the internet the particular price of each item or the estimated price of items for planning a trip. So, what would they pack to go on a particular trip? And so, again, communicative purpose here was expressing what they would pack for a particular place, season, time of year that of a trip they were planning to take or that a trip they hoped to take in the future. But you could also have them do a collage about things like sexism or equality, spirituality, um, wellness, right? So exploring themes with images, and you could absolutely ask them to include captions so that there's also written words along with their pictures. And then they would present those either by posting them around the classroom and doing a gallery walk, or perhaps walking around with their poster and talking individually one-on-one with other students. You can have your students conduct a survey or an experiment. And this is one I always like to do, where you have a question. So, for example, in our 101 class here at NC State, we ask students to come up with a research question about college students, and then they go out and interview or survey college students about that topic. So, there's been all kinds of topics, but everything from, do you tend to recycle when you're in college, living in a dorm, to how do you best learn language outside the classroom? Like, what strategies do you use? What resources do you use? And then they compile that information and share that information in a research paper and a presentation. And these are college students, but certainly you could make this a smaller activity or a less cognitively loaded activity by asking things like, what did you do on the weekend? What do you enjoy eating at a particular holiday or preparing for a particular holiday? What is your favorite ice cream flavor? And then again, compiling that information and sharing it. So the communicative task or purpose here is sharing information, learning about each other, learning about the world around us and our community. How about writing lyrics to music? I've never personally tried this, but I would like to. I've had students tell me that they have used like tunes that are very familiar. And I guess I could say I've done this in Spanish, but I created the songs. I didn't have the students create the songs. So that would have been better. Where you take like a tune that everybody knows, like "She'll Be Coming Around the Mountain" or "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," or "I Have a Dog Named Bingo," or a poem like "Roses Are Red, Violets Are Blue," something, very um, familiar to English speakers at least. And you have students replace the words with lyrics about a particular topic. Okay. One video that I shared with you earlier in the class, under content, language, and instruction was where students were testing an egg drop container. So they're in small collaborative groups, they created containers that were supposed to protect an egg. And then the teacher held it up from a tall ladder and dropped them. And they saw what happened. Did the egg break or not break? And then they had to redesign their container accordingly and then describe what they had done with a drawing and captions to explain how they were trying to protect the egg with that drop-in container. And then the last communicative language task that I wanted to share was perhaps researching and planning a trip to a national park or to a museum or to a city, or any particular place that students really feel compelled or interested in visiting. And again, here the communicative task and purpose would be to gather information. All right. What are some other examples that you can think of? When I posed this question to my class earlier this semester, one of my students who teaches Spanish at NC State talked about a food unit that they teach. So the students learned a lot of vocabulary about foods, and then they were given the task of planning 3 meals for 1 to 2 days based upon a particular budget and dietary restrictions. So then they had to look at websites and get recipes and then create a grocery list that would work to create those meals. So again, this would be including expression, right? It would definitely include interpretation, and it certainly would have the communicative purpose of cognitive informational. Other examples that have come up in previous classes that I have taught is one teacher said that she had students look at like 3 or 4 different artists and decide which concert they would like to go to as a class by looking at the lyrics, the songs, the band profiles, and try to argue which one would be most interesting to classmates. Or just an alternative to that or a slight variation, which area in the North Carolina Museum of Art should we visit? The Egyptian section, the modern art, the classic European paintings, maybe the Rodin sculptures or something outside in the gardens. And so students could vote upon that based upon the interests of classmates. So if we were in an interactive class, I'd ask you to look at this Azerbaijani English language textbook, from which I have been working with English language teachers from that country, from Azerbaijan, and to select an activity or an exercise and to rewrite it to be a task. And so I have done that for you. There's some examples here for you to explore. These are the topics, and these are topics that are very common in early lower level proficiency English books, right? And then I came up with a task and a description. So you're welcome to explore those for further ideas, further examples. And that is it. So I hope that this clarifies for you a little bit more about what I mean about communicative language teaching, and specifically using that language of exercise, activity, or task with the goal of really incorporating tasks into our teaching. So thanks for your attention. Thanks for watching this. Reach out with any questions, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Bye-bye.